All right, so we are going to continue where we left off talking about ancient Greece here with our very quick review. When we last left off, the ancient Greeks had lost the Peloponnesian War, and the great statesman Pericles will die. And the problem with that is no one else in Greece sort of knew what to do, in Athens rather, no one knew what to do to cure the ills of the Peloponnesian War. The great philosopher Socrates spoke out, says, hey guys, let's quit worrying about who's going to be in charge and worry about the Spartans that are outside knocking on the door. During this 30-year period where Pericles was governing Athens, is the cultural high point and flowering of many things that happened in ancient Greece. This is the time where we get the great tragic playwrights. And tragedies are stories that have a moral, usually to honor the great god Dionysus. Nowadays, he's more commonly known as Mr. D, thanks to Rick Riordan in the Percy Jackson series. And there are three great playwrights: Aeschylus, who is the father of the tragedy, Sophocles, and Euripides. Remember my big joke, if you Euripides pants, it's going to be a tragedy. And these three playwrights write stories to have Athens and all of Greece guard against hubris, or more commonly known as excessive pride. Getting too cocky. The formula works: a hero will do something to come to power, to become a hero. In the second movement, he will make a tragic mistake. And in the third movement, there will be the consequences of that action. You know, Hercules, Theseus and the Minotaur, stories like that. They're great stories, and they teach us good things, but my God, they get depressing after a while. So shortly after those guys comes a guy named Aristophanes. Very easy to remember him because Aristophanes was funny. Aristophanes. And Aristophanes brings about a satire-like comedy where, much like Saturday Night Live, politicians were kind of mocked and made fun of. They did not like this, you know, with the imitations of, you know, let me be clear and things of that nature. They didn't like them, but the people loved it, and it pretty soon came to be known as if Aeschylus wasn't making fun of you, you were not doing your job, because leaders are decisive. And when you make a decision, sometimes people don't like it. So if you're not acting, then that means no one can be angry at what you're doing. So people said, if Aeschylus isn't making fun of you, you are not decisively working for the good of Athens. So guys who at one time did not like him, all of a sudden began to recruit him, invite him to dinner, and encourage him to make fun of them to keep themselves elected. Greek architecture and sculpture is very idealistic. Everything was seen in its best possible light. So statues were made, everybody was thickly muscled, they were well proportioned, thin waists, broad shoulders, nobody was fat or skinny, your warts and your blemishes would not show up. Everything was as beautiful as it could be, signified by the Parthenon, the headquarters of the Acropolis, to the patron goddess of Athens, Athena, and her 40-foot tall statue in there. So those are all the great things going on. History becomes written with the father of history known as Herodotus, who wrote about the history of the Persian Wars, and what he could not verify himself, he kind of made up. He is followed by another Greek historian named Thucydides, who put no bias in his writing. He said, If he could not corroborate it, he wrote on the Peloponnesian Wars. If he could not corroborate his story with someone from either side, he did not include it. So his history is more factual. Also, during this time, we're going to have the Dr. Hippocrates, who is going to open a school of medicine. They will look to treat illnesses and injuries, find out what medicines, what herbs can be made into medicines, and look at the cause and the symptoms and the cure for illnesses. And as he taught openly, he made his students take an oath. And this oath says you will never experiment on a patient. You must seek to save their lives. And all doctors to this day must take the Hippocratic oath. Eventually, we're going to get around 350 BC. And as Greek culture will spread around the world, we will have the coming to power of Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was a young boy. He was Macedonian, and his dad, Philip, was captured by the Greeks for a while, and he came to love and respect Greek culture. So he hired one of the big three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle was hired to be Alexander's tutor. And from Aristotle, Alexander learned to love and respect all Greek culture. And as he grows up, he and his dad will subjugate the Greeks who were fighting the massive civil war and killing themselves. And when young Alexander takes over, he wants to partially get back at Persia for the damage Persia did to Athens during the Persian Wars and also the Peloponnesian Wars. So Alexander will quickly move against Persian states in Turkey, always picking fights he felt he could win. He will go down to Egypt to secure a good food supply route for himself. And while there, he went to an oracle, and it was revealed to him, lo and behold, that he was a descendant of the Greek demigod Hercules. And Alexander's army will grow conquest by conquest till he gets over into the Middle East, where King Darius III says, "Hey, Alex, why don't we divide the empire between us, and I will give you the hand of one of my daughters in marriage." And Alexander legendarily said, "Well, I only have half the empire and one of your daughters when I can defeat you and take them all and your whole empire." Alexander eventually wins, and he keeps going, and he will conquer all the way to modern-day Pakistan, the Indus River Valley, when his soldiers from Macedonia say, "Look, Al, we just want to go home." They had been fighting for 10 years and had conquered about 11,000 miles of territory. Losing the support of his most ardent supporters, Alexander goes back to, we don't know if it was Persepolis, some say it was Baghdad, where at the age of 32 he will die. In the meantime, Alexander had carved out the biggest empires the world had seen to that date. And it was a vast and a multicultural empire. And Alexander was a warrior, but he was also an intellectual. And he took with him zoologists and botanists and linguists and secretaries. And they chronicled all of the learning and the knowledge and the plants and the animals that they encountered. Next time in history we see a guy with that knowledge and intellect about everything could be probably like Thomas Jefferson or somebody like that. But Alexander will blend everything that he learned into what is called a Hellenistic civilization or culture. It is Greek culture matching with that of Egypt, the Middle East, and India. It's a blending of all of those things. And before he left Egypt, Alexander started work on a museum, a university called the House of Muses for the 9 Greek goddesses of knowledge and learning. And he will also build a lighthouse, a 400-foot tall lighthouse called the Lighthouse of the Pharaohs, to aid shipping coming in the Mediterranean, coming into Egypt. And he purposely left it shorter than the Great Pyramid of Khufu or Cheops out of respect for the engineering of the ancient Greeks. So he was a smart guy. At the House of Muses, there were lecture halls. There was a library full of 10,000 scrolls. There were language laboratories. There were meeting rooms, studies where you could look down and watch like a medical procedure. It was a modern working university, and many people went there to study and or increase their education. In the House of Muses is the collected works of all that was known in the region. Pythagoras and the theory of the right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, will be housed there. The mathematician Euclid will look at the combined works of geometry from Egypt, from Sumeria, from India, and write the textbook, The Elements, the textbook some of you will still use to learn geometry, which you probably did in 7th or 8th grade. Archimedes and the simple machines, the pulley, the lever, the inclined plane, all of these scientists will study in and around or work at the House of Muses. So Alexander will divide his empire up into, 3 of his more favorite generals. And that is the way Greece will remain until they are taken over by the Romans. And the Greeks left us many gifts, probably more so than any ancient culture or civilization we have studied. Things and the ideas of law and government and politics, freedom, justice, philosophy. Socrates, question leadership. Question them. Get to the root of the truth. Why? How? Explain. Unless you can explain why you came to that conclusion, who says you can make a decision for me? Plato going in search of the best government, looking for idealistic beauty. And Aristotle saying, seek a moderation in all things, and that the job of a government is to assist its people to achieve their fullest potential. Things that will influence the Enlightenment thinkers, Republican Rome, the English Bill of Rights, the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence have their roots way back here in ancient Greece. So, we're next to do our whiz-bang AP World History tour. Is we are going to head to ancient Rome. Everybody loves Rome. Rome is big. It's an empire. It's awesome. Hoorah and hooray. And Rome is just one of those just neat places. I don't really know what else to say about it as I get myself organized here, or I will just talk forever and ever and ever. And Rome's location is key to their development and becoming a great empire. Italy sits right smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean. Rome is situated halfway up the Italian peninsula. There are the Apennine Mountains, which run down Italy like a spinal column, surrounded by the Adriatic Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Alps to the north, and it sits up the Tiber River. So the city of Rome itself, centered in Italy, with long flat plains on either coast, makes it ideally suited to unify its territory. Unlike ancient Greece, Italy was pretty easy to unify. and thereby command an empire that will stretch over 3 continents. And the original Romans, the twin brothers Romulus and Remus will legendarily found the city of Rome, which is built on 7 hills around the Tiber River. These 7 hills make the city of Rome a natural acropolis. And so, the landscape was very key. The city was founded around 800 BC when the Romans had been enslaved by 2 groups, the Etruscans and the Greeks. And after a while, the Roman population grew. They turned and attacked their Etruscan masters and defeated them. They then went south and lost a battle to the Greeks, but did so much damage, the Greeks retreated. And the Romans, around 500 BC, will be masters of their own peninsula. And the Romans are some of the great adapters of the world. They will take an idea and borrow it and morph it and make it better than what it was. And so from the Etruscans, they learn about the arch, the strongest piece of engineering invented yet. From the Greeks, they learn how to drain marshy land and irrigate. And after defeating the Etruscans and the Greeks, the Romans got together and said that we are never, ever, ever going to be ruled by a king again. And they create what is known as the Roman Republic, a government in which the people get to choose their leaders. But the early Roman government was dominated by a wealthy group of people known as patricians. Very easy to remember that the patricians were rich, wealthy landowners because they were patrician. And they will dominate the early republic in a thing known as the Senate, where 300 members got to serve in the Senate and make the laws for the people. It was a prestigious job, and once you were in, you had a lifetime appointment. It was a job you could not lose, sort of similar to the United States Supreme Court. And so it was one of the old, rich guys get to run the show once again. The majority of Romans were called plebeians, or second-class citizen. If you go to a military academy or sometimes a fraternity, or you are known as a plebe, you are second class until your freshman year is over. And in Rome, plebes were everyone. It was artisans, it was merchants, it was farmers, you name it, virtually everyone was a plebeian. And they were closed out of the governing process. And it's going to take the Romans a very long time to eventually work their way into leadership roles in ancient Rome. Other significant offices in ancient Rome was the Roman office of the consul. And the consul is someone chosen, there were 2 of them, chosen to administer the laws of Rome. They served a 1-year term, and they had special powers. Number 1, they were co-commanders-in-chief of the Roman army. They were the executives or the enforcers of Roman law. They had to be elected. They only served a 1-year term limit. There was 2 of them to check the power on each other, and they were able to veto each other if there was a problem. So the founding fathers in Philadelphia very closely studied the office of the consul in creating the United States president. But the consul is very, very prestigious. And in times of dire crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator who had absolute power for 6 months. Someone that would be in charge to solve a immediate and a dire crisis. Easiest or best example of this would be the great dictator Cincinnatus, who was plowing his field, was asked to save a Roman consul who was surrounded by barbarians in Gaul. Cincinnatus saves the consul, comes back home, gives up total power, and goes back to plowing his field. He was a role model for many Romans, including the most famous one of them all, Julius Caesar. The plebeians will fight and for years and years and years, and finally in around 450 BC, they will gain a voice in the government known as the 12 Tables. And the 12 Tables were codifies Roman law. It says that patricians and plebeians will be tried equal, or laws apply to both of them the same. There will be no difference. Eventually, after the Roman patricians got involved in another battle they could not win, tribunes were created. The plebeians said, "We'll come help you, patricians, but you have to give us access to the government." And you would think, well, shoot, if they finally get their way, they can ask for 150 seats in the Senate. They get 10. And this office is the office of a tribune. And a tribune will be elected to look after plebeian interests. In 367, the first tribune is elected as a consul. And in 287, a lower house, think of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, the Roman Assembly is created where plebeians could get elected and sit and be part of the governing process. Now, throughout this time, the Romans conquered some of their neighbors, and some of the neighbors got pretty good treatment. You could be an ally of Rome, you could trade with Rome, you were subject to Roman protection, as long as you gave men for the army. And there comes an unwritten rule, so to speak, where the territory that an army conquers, they get to keep it. It's a reward for their serving in the Roman army. Now, you could get a few acres of land back in ancient Rome, or a few hundred or thousand acres in France or Spain or northern Italy. And so many soldiers would retire and settle there. And this was actually a brilliant maneuver by the Roman government, because if invaders came to attack you, in order to get to Rome, there was a series of retired pockets of Roman soldiers and armies, guys with fighting skill, that they had to get through first in order to get to you. So they formed like a shield around Rome, these veteran seasoned armies. Eventually, Rome is going to come into contact with another mighty empire down in North Africa, ancient Carthage, in what is today Tunis in Tunisia. And as the Romans began to expand on the northern rim of the Mediterranean, the Carthaginians controlled the southern half. And the two will engage in a series of wars running from 264 BC to around 200 BC. In the first war, Carthage is defeated and they have to give up the island of Sicily. And they and the Romans divide the Mediterranean in half. We won't bother your people if you don't bother ours. But they will chain up the Carthaginian leader Hamilcar and drag him through the streets of his city, humiliating and embarrassing him. And Hamilcar had a young son named Hannibal. And he made Hannibal swear to be an enemy of Rome forever. So with his dad gone, Hannibal will put together a large multicultural army from all over the Carthaginian Empire. He will eventually take half of his army into Spain, cross the Pyrenees, the legendary journey across the Alps, and for 15 years he will attack Roman territory. Just as he is about to defeat Rome, the Romans went and laid siege to Carthage, forcing Hannibal to come home and to defend it. The second half of his army that he left behind to meet him in Italy when he was ready to strike the Romans was killed and massacred by one of the Roman legions. The Romans, as I said once again, are great at adaptation. They knew they created Hannibal when they killed his dad. So they leave Hannibal in charge, and then they say, you can never raise an army against Rome again. Hannibal says, great, sure, no problem. Wink, wink, fingers crossed. And when the Romans leave, he begins to put his army back together. They send assassins for him rather than be humiliated like his dad. Hannibal will take poison. And a little while later, a general named Scipio Africanus, will come down, and on the plains of Zama, he will defeat Carthage. He will kill the Carthaginians. This is the famous scene that is reenacted in the movie Gladiator, where Maximus reveals his identity to the emperor. And the Romans, to show their power, will kill the men Carthaginians. They will enslave the women and the children. And then they will dump salt on the farmland where the Carthaginians grew their crops. Now, salt was extremely valuable in the ancient world. It was actually worth more than gold, as it enabled you to preserve your food. Excuse me, I mind blanked there when the bell rang. To preserve your food. So by the Romans destroying Carthage and taking the very expensive and exclusive mineral salt and dumping it on the earth, it showed everyone else their power. And this is when Rome becomes what I call the imperial star system. They started as a small kingdom and a regional empire, and when they conquer Carthage, all of a sudden their empire blows up, and they are a massive world empire controlling land on 3 continents. And it is at this time that they begin to call the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. And so now, how do you control an empire? Kingdom was one thing, but an empire brings in much different responsibilities. And the people on the southern rim of the Mediterranean were treated more harshly than the Roman allies in the north. Roman governors were sent out to police these lands, guys sent out by the Roman government who had no real checks on their power. They could pretty much do whatever they so chose. And they demanded that their subjects pay tribute. Romans no longer had to pay taxes, as the Romans will suck and extract wealth from their massive empire. And this sounds like a good idea at first, but it will come back to haunt the Romans. But the general whose army conquered it gets to keep the profits. And so this will eventually show up causing harm in ancient Rome, as the separation between rich and poor, between patrician and plebeian, is going to grow. Because of the wealth being extracted from the conquered territories, a lot of Italian artisans and farmers were put out of business. Come on in. No one would buy their products, no one would buy their products if you could get it cheaper from a Roman noble across the world.
Is there AP today?
I was going to do some, just answer questions for a half hour if you guys had them. So is that cool?
Do you want me to stay out here? Are you recording a
You
podcast?
can come on in. That's fine. All right. So you just leave the door open for us. We got special guest Forrest P. Dog Prattson in the house. I will end with the story of the Gracchi brothers. And because of this separation of rich and poor, the Romans lose their jobs. They lose their houses. And the rich gobble up more and more land, which they call a latifundia, which I say, remember, it was not a latifundia to work on a latifundia. There we go. And so eventually, when this problem is exacerbated, two Roman brothers are going to try and solve the problem, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Now, they are members of the equestrian order. They will try and give land back to the peasants. For their trouble, they are assassinated. And their assassination will set the precedent to accomplish your goals in Rome. You can kill and assassinate a leader. Next up is the rise of the first triumvirate, Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, and we'll pick that up later on. All right, you can stop it. Yeah. I figured